AgTech 360 discusses breakthrough technologies that are impacting growers, businesses, and consumers. Hear from industry and academic experts about what's on the horizon.
Welcome to AgTech 360. Today we're spotlighting another game-changing advancement for the farm in our Harvesting Innovation series. We have Chris Whitney, Chief Digital Officer at Monarch Tractor, here with us. His company has developed the world's first fully electric driver-optional tractor. I'm excited to speak with Chris and learn more about how Monarch is combining clean energy, autonomy, and AI to power the next generation of sustainable farm machinery. Thanks for joining me, Chris.
No worries, Adrian. Happy to be here.
So before we go on to discuss Monarch's technology, I was hoping you'd just share a little bit about your background and what first drew you into agriculture and agtech.
I'm a computer scientist, a software guy. I spent all my career, the last 40 years, in software, specializing in artificial intelligence. I started working in AI in the mid-80s from the UK. I was working with a lot of research labs in different industries, defense, communications, IT. Eventually moved my way over to Silicon Valley as part of the dot-com rush. Did a lot more AI work with startups, moved into cloud computing. And then in 98, I moved over to Singapore to run Hewlett-Packard's cloud and AI research. In about 2019, I wanted to come back to Silicon Valley, and I met the Monarch guys who told me about their vision for building autonomous electric tractors to focus on economically sustainable agriculture, which we can talk about a little bit later on. So kind of that's how I got into agriculture. It was really through my AI autonomy background.
So you have been with Monarch a little bit of time now. So can you take us back a little bit about how these conversations kind of evolved, and why did Monarch see the need to build this new type of tractor, and what were some of the hurdles that you initially had to overcome?
Absolutely. Back in 2019, when we started the company, I was talking to Praveen, who's the CEO, and we were investigating or kind of like filling each other out. And I was intrigued by what Monarch was doing. They wanted to build an electric tractor. They wanted to build an autonomous tractor, and they wanted to build a tractor that could collect data so that we could do advanced analytics on the farm. When I asked Praveen, kind of like, well, what are we focusing on here? Are we just focusing on doing electrification or autonomy? Are we looking about how we can do full farm automation so that we can actually, help a farmer get into more sustainable agricultural practices? And during those conversations, it became very, very clear that there was a very big need for the use of artificial intelligence to drive the type of autonomy that we needed for Monarch. And that's what really piqued my interest. It wasn't just about building a tractor with a battery instead of a diesel engine. It was really harnessing the ability to use AI to build the type of models that we need to do automation in the domains that Monarch really, really focuses on.
Can you kind of talk a little bit about how all that comes together, and maybe are there things that are unique about what you're doing in the agricultural context as opposed to maybe what we would see with a Tesla and an autonomous vehicle?
We built a 40 horsepower tractor. It's a 40 horsepower tractor that we built. We call it the Mark V. We built it from the ground up. We introduced a battery. It's a multi-layer battery, which is slightly different from what you see in kind of like in an EV like Tesla, which is a flat pancake-like battery. We had to do that because of the form factor. So we built a multi-layer battery. We built it so it was extractable, so you could do a field swap for the battery in the field. And so it's kind of like a Black & Decker drill. When the battery runs down, you take the battery out, you put another one, and you carry on with your work. So we wanted to have that kind of concept so we can get the work cycles. So fundamentally, that's what we had to prove first of all, was that with an electric battery, with a 40 horsepower tractor, could you get the work cycles, 8 to 10 hours that people typically use a 40 horsepower tractor for, specifically in things like vertically trellis farmings, when you're doing things like vineyards or blueberries or apples that are planted in rows. So that was the first thing. We basically designed a battery pack that would fit into the form factor of a tractor rather than a flat wide battery. It had to be stacked. And that was a challenge in itself, looking at things like thermal propagation, how can you extract the battery, put the battery in. On top of that, we basically built a fully drive-by-wire system, which is fairly unique in terms of what we've done. That drive-by-wire system basically meant from a computer, we can control everything from the velocity of the tractor, the steering, which gear the tractor was in. So anything to do with driving the tractor. But more importantly, it gave us full control of things like controlling the PTO and controlling the hitch position. We have full drive-by-wire capability of everything on the tractor. So anything a human would typically do when they're sitting in the seat, we can control that via a computer, which brought us into kind of like autonomy. So now we can hook up a computer to the CAN lines. We can read all the information off the tractor, so we can get very, very detailed diagnostics, understanding of what's happening in the machine layer. But we can also control the tractor. We can change the steering angle. So we have complete control now. And so now the interesting thing comes, and this is where I come in, is like, how do you get rid of the driver off the seat? So, we started to look at the kind of sensors that we would put around our compute platform for what we're trying to do. And here comes another very interesting dynamic as well, because if you're building a big tractor, 250 horsepower, $500,000 machine, which is going to go and autonomously, I don't know, till the fields in soy farms or wheat, and you can afford to put a lot of tech in there. But you have a set amount of room to put things like high quality sensors, compute stacks, networking stacks. When you're working in the 40 horsepower range, the price point of the tractor drops quite dramatically. You're in the 50, 60K price point. So you cannot be putting $20, $30, $40,000 autonomy hardware in there to run autonomy. You can't be looking at kind of like solid state LiDARs around. You can't use spinning LiDARs because you'll destroy them in the field in a heartbeat. And so you really need to start thinking about how do we actually get autonomy on a reference architecture, which potentially could have to be less than $8,000 inside a 40 horsepower tractor. And so we went down a sensor route, which was very visual. So we have stereo cameras on the front of the tractor, on the rear of the tractor. We have molecular cameras all around the tractor for safety. And that's our primary sensor suite, along with things like IM music. We have GPS as a reference point, because sometimes you need to know where you are in the mapping. But our autonomy stack is predicated on vision, which brings us into AI, because now with the neural network algorithms, et cetera, segmentation, geometric modeling, and we use AI, machine learning to do that. So we're in this kind of like perpetual loop now, whereby as we're driving the tractors, we're gathering data. As we gather data, we learn what it means to keep the tractor in the right position. We learn from the machine what the driver's doing, steering angles. We can apply that through our machine learning pipelines that we run out of our lab in Singapore, where I am at the moment. We can OTA that back down to the tractor. So we're constantly learning about what it means to automate in a particular domain.
You've mentioned a lot of different crops, a lot of different operations. Do you see Monarch kind of being successful everywhere with your approach, or are there areas of particular types of crops and particular types of situations that you feel the technology is more suited for?
I think that's one of the things we talk about. We talk about the fact that we work in mud environments, and we mean messy, unstructured, dynamic domains. I mean, that's really what we're talking about. And on the first side, when you walk into some of our domains, for example, when we first started working in dairy and we first started looking at feed pushing, it looks like a fairly static domain. The cows are in their pens behind the line. There's no vehicles around. Your tractor can go up and down with a pushing feed closer and closer, et cetera, et cetera. But after a while, you start to realize, hey, that gate is supposed to be open. The tractor can't go through. How am I supposed to recognize that gate? What am I supposed to do? Why is there a truck in the lane? Am I supposed to go around that truck or not? There's a lot of particulates that get on your lenses, et cetera, when you're in a dairy farm.
We know what you mean.
You know what we mean. The cattle grids are sometimes full, et cetera, et cetera. Sometimes the cows are wandering around inside the lane. So your autonomy has to anticipate all of that stuff. And again, this is why we believe, having a visual-based approach where you can actually use techniques like object detection, segmentation, geometric modeling, you can bring those things together into a fairly sophisticated perception stack where you can recognize as objects. And if you don't recognize an object, you can take a default action, which is stop. We can pass the video information to our machine learning pipeline, retrain the model and say, hey, next time do this because that's actually a cow. We do say that we specialize in messy, unstructured, dynamic environments. And, we believe the autonomy approach that we've done enables us to do that.
The North Carolina Plant Sciences Initiative impacts lives through innovative applications and discoveries. By leveraging cutting-edge research and technology, we address global challenges related to agriculture, sustainability, and human health.
Coming back to agriculture, farmers, I mean, how have they reacted to to your technology? Now, are there any kind of unexpected benefits that you've heard from farmers that perhaps you weren't anticipating? And coming back
it's always a journey with farmers. I mean, I think the thing with ag tech, farmers have been burnt many times. I mean, people have talked about this to the farmers. So it's a confidence building, it's a learning journey. And this is actually how we work with farmers. When we go into a situation, we don't, say to a farmer, hey, flick a switch and you've got autonomy. We actually take them through a process. There's a gated process we go through to make sure the farmer's ready to adopt technology. And that could be simple things like training, do you have the right communications infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a series of things that you need to do. I think some of the unexpected feedback that we got and some of the things we weren't thinking about, just going back to the dairy example again, dairy farmers got excited about the systems we were putting in place was, cows need to be fed on a 24/7 basis, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock. That feed needs to be pushed into their pens. Farmers generally don't know what's happening at 1, 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning. Are those cows really being fed? You're relying on kind of like your hired help to actually get out there at 1 o'clock and push the feed. Generally, no electronic records in agriculture about whether that took place or not. There's a lack of visibility. There's no traceability. Because of the data that we collect around, yes, we ran autonomy at 1 o'clock. Yes, we ran autonomy at 2 o'clock. Yes, we ran autonomy at 3 o'clock. There's all of these data reports that we can now present back to the farmer about what actually happened. And so, the milk yields of some of the customers we were working with started to increase just because they were getting fed regularly, they were getting fed properly.
Looking forward, how do you see the adoption cycle going? And are there any hurdles that you're kind of trying to overcome and mitigate?
There's the regulatory environment as well, because farming is an industrial practice. A lot of the farms, specifically in California, they're covered by OSHA. Occupational Health and Safety Agency. So we've got to make sure, and we're spending a lot of time, along with a lot of other people who work in ag tech, in trying to push the autonomy regulations along. They tend to lag behind. So we have to spend a lot of time proving that our tractors are safe around people. And so, we spend a lot of time on the safety aspects of what we do. And so convincing OSHA in California that your tractor is safe around humans, that if someone comes close to a tractor when it's running autonomously, that tractor will stop. And there's the regulatory environment. That changes from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. But that's a very, very important part. And so I think the regulatory environment needs to change, specifically in the EU, where the regulatory environment around autonomy is even higher. I think the second thing is just an appreciation of what actually has to go around autonomy to make it successful in the farm. The ability from a remote station to be able to communicate with your machine, and connectivity in rural environments can be quite sketchy. And so, it's not just about sending the command and control, start autonomy, stop autonomy, change autonomy, etc. But can I see the video feeds? Can I, if I'm in a remote location and the tractor stops and says, hey, I've stopped, can I get information about why the tractor stopped? So trying to understand kind of that level of, human in the loop is very, very important. And that comes down to the third thing around, are the farms themselves ready to adopt autonomy? So again, it really depends on the skills level that you have available. So we have to make autonomy easy to be digestible by the masses. It can't be the PhD people I have in my labs or people like myself who are running autonomy. It has to be brought to a level where it can be widely adopted. And then there's the variability from domain to domain, which is why our machine learning pipelines we're constantly pushing out new models, because one farm may be growing grapes next to another farm, but the way they do it, the vine spacings, it may be very, very different. So I think there's multiple things that people need to look at, and there's still a lot of work to be done.
I hear you. There are lots of challenges in that. I know you'll be working on them, or others will be working on them. What does the future look like from your perspective? What are you kind of dreaming of in terms of, you can decide the kind of timeline if it's 5, 10, 20, 50 years, but how do you see kind of electric fundamentally changing agriculture in the future?
I think there's a question mark about where our food comes from currently, and I think there's two approaches. There's the there's a revolutionary approach to, and you see a lot of investments. We're talking about kind of like the investments that the VCs are making at the moment. And I would say the revolutionary approach to how we get carbohydrates and proteins, synthetic foods, fermentationally grown foods as a way, using insects, etc., as a way of like feeding people. But there are hundreds of millions of acres of land out there which need to be traditionally farmed to actually fill that gap. Until we're all eating fermentally grown crop, agriculture is going to be a discipline that's going to be around for centuries and centuries and centuries. I think a couple of things that we need to be very, very cognizant of is people these days in many countries. I was actually talking to an organization in Japan about the difficulty that they have in Japan about getting people to work the land. I think that's a factor. So I would say autonomy is probably one of the biggest drivers that we're going to see, the increased use of autonomy in farming, because we do need to get that labor equation out of producing food. I think one of the things we need to be thinking about in terms of, specifically batteries, in terms of density and weight, and diesel tanks on a tractor still weigh less than a battery pack. So I think we have a good weight. And I can't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but we have a good weight distribution for a 40 horsepower tractor. But electrifying maybe a 500 horsepower tractor, we need to do the math around the battery pack. We need to look at the size of the batteries. We need to look at charging those batteries. We need to look at the weight, salt compression, etc., etc. So maybe we need to be looking at different form factors of machines. Maybe we need to be looking at smaller machines swarming rather than big machines trying to do the job. So I think there's a lot to look forward to, and there's going to be a lot of dynamics at play.
With that, Chris, and thank you for your passion for explaining all of these different interconnected technologies and what they mean for farming. I really appreciate you being on the podcast, so thanks so much.
AgTech 360 shares relevant news and breakthroughs with audiences across the globe. Stay connected and join the conversation by following NCPSI on social media.